Welcome to the home for history!
Yay!
Copyright, trademark, patent pending. My name is Woody LeBounty. This is the Western Neighborhoods Project. We are a history group that's focused on the west side of San Francisco and San Francisco neighborhoods. We also have a photo site that has more than 40,000 historical photos of all of San Francisco. So if you don't know who we are, please take a magazine or a brochure on the way out. We do events like this. We do walks. John Martini just led a great walk in Golden Gate Park on Saturday. We do talks. We have a podcast that comes out every week, totally free, with Nicole and David and myself. And before I introduce these two gentlemen, I just want to point out there's a lot of celebrity historians here tonight. And I'm very honored to have Mr. Glenn Koch here, Angus McFarland, John Freeman, and cemetery historian Deanna Castle. So it's awesome to have you guys all here. A lot of people who aren't members or don't know who we are signed up for tickets tonight. They're not here. I don't know. They're lost probably, but they'll figure it out when they get here. So we had a talk last year where Alex and John discussed the little coffin that was found over near Rossi Playground and caused a whole bunch of news coverage. And then everybody started figuring out, wow, there was a cemetery over there. So it was a very great presentation. And that, are you guys going to talk about how you guys got this thing going, or should I do it?
Well,
anyway, these two started talking at that event, and this led to investigating city cemetery. So we're going to have you guys talk about that, right?
Yeah.
All right, Mr. John Martini and Mr. Alex Ryder. Yay!
I'm John Martini, a member of Western Neighborhoods in a previous life. I was with the National Park Service, GGNRA, from San Francisco to serve a great career track. And then after retiring, you never give up on the history of your hometown. And Alex, I'll let you introduce yourself.
So I'm Alex Ryder. I am actually a transportation planner by day, but history has always been a passion of mine. Always been fascinated by the stories that we're able to uncover when we look at primary sources and interpret them. And I got involved in, as Woody said earlier, I got involved in the effort to identify the young girl that was found in the backyard of that home near Rossi Park, and did some of the mapping for that work. Was able to show which family plots had occupied the backyard of this individual's home, and other researchers were able to take it from there, and eventually, we got positive identification. So that was my introduction to. I was actually unemployed at the time, still looking for work, and I was like, I think I could help out with this project. I saw a newspaper article, and that was my introduction to San Francisco's cemetery history. I'd never lived in a city that has had a relationship with its dead quite like San Francisco has, and it's a fascinating topic. And yeah, John and I met about 9 months ago.
You thought all we had was the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought before I moved here, and then I was like, oh wow, these people are really serious about their dead.
Hi, come on in. When, in fact, it was at the presentation here about 9 months ago.
Yeah.
I came up afterwards. I said, absolutely fantastic research that you've done. Did you ever hear of City Cemetery out at Lincoln Park? He said, no, I haven't. So we made a time and met. We went for a walk, and that's what got us started. Essentially, City Cemetery is San Francisco's forgotten cemetery. Probably, it's fair to say, to a lot of newcomers, the fact that there were cemeteries in San Francisco is a huge revelation. Even old-time San Franciscans, Lincoln Park Cemetery is a revelation. It was almost always called City Cemetery, and it was the city-owned giant cemetery, essentially what's now Lincoln Park Golf Course. Occasionally the name Golden Gate Cemetery picks up, but everybody at the time knew it as City Cemetery. And I kind of to give you a little bit of background of why they ended up having a cemetery out there in the 1880s in the middle of nowhere, essentially. And it was an outgrowth of the theme that I kind of call, what do you do with your dead? And here in San Francisco, the earliest European burial grounds were at Mission Dolores, the Mission Dolores Cemetery, starting as whenever the cemetery, when the mission opened, either clergy or the neophytes, the Native Americans who were pretty much being press ganged into staying at the mission, when they passed on, the cemetery was established. And a lot of pioneer Californians, especially before the gold rush, ended up being buried at Mission Dolores Cemetery. There may be as many as about 9,000 burials that extended out well beyond what we see today. Today is just a small fraction. How many have been recovered is questionable. But when the gold rush broke in 1849, what happened was all of a sudden San Francisco's population went from about 450 to 35,000 in about 2.5 years. And a lot of these people were dying. Young people, young guys unprepared for California and prepared for the gold rush. You had diseases that ran through. There was cholera, there was smallpox, there were murders. At one time I read San Francisco was averaging a murder a night in the late 1840s. What'd you do with those dead people? Sometimes they were just thrown into the bay in the hope that the tide would take them out. An informal burial ground was formed in North Beach near around Powell, between Powell and Greenwich. And because it seemed like it was the middle of nowhere. And this is sort of a bad simile, but I think you understand that if you go to the Safeway lot and you got your shopping cart and you just unloaded your groceries and you see another lonely shopping cart over there, well, rather than take it to the official drop-off point, you don't go just jam it up next to the other cart. That's what happened. These informal burial grounds, several of them were popping up around North Beach, the slopes of Telegraph Hill, and the city was expanding out. And pretty soon it was obvious that these people had to be moved somewhere else. So a place was chosen halfway between the downtown area and Mission Dolores, middle of nowhere, and the sand is well beyond where the city would ever grow. And that was established in 1850, and it was called Yerba Buena Cemetery. And it was rude. It was just rolling dunes, scrub brush. There were parcels where there were formal burials that took place. The numbered headstones up here, Potter's Field. You know what a Potter's Field is? Where the indigent people get buried. It was the city's burial ground. These are the floaters that were found in the bay. These were people that were disinterred from those informal cemeteries with no identification. It was never very popular because it was in a pretty godforsaken part of town. Weather wasn't very conducive. So what happened was,
It's one of those two red dots.
this is Mission Dolores.
Okay.
This is Yerba Buena
Oh,
Cemetery.
that's the
Yeah. People that wanted to have a more formal burial in a real proper park-like setting, a Jewish cemetery was established only a few blocks from Mission Dolores. And this is now Dolores Park. But this was the home of peace. And what was the other cemetery?
Hills of Eternity.
Hills of Eternity. They were there till 1894.
The Jewish cemetery people are well represented.
Yeah, well, I realized how quickly everybody jumped in. The area was desirable for recreation purposes and open space, and the congregations sold the land of the city and moved everybody in 1894. So that's pretty early on. That cemetery's moving out. There were 1888. The 1894, perhaps the date when the last left.
They said it took about 15 years.
Yeah,
15
it
years.
doesn't happen fast. We'll talk about that later. A couple more dots are going to appear on the map, and this is where we're called the Big Four Cemeteries were located. Yep. Again, further out still, they were clustered around what was called Lone Mountain. Yep. And the Lone Mountain cemeteries, eventually there were 4 of them. There was Oddfellow Cemetery, which is shown here. That's where Edith Cook was found. Rossi Playground area today. Okay. And you had Masonic, University of San Francisco campus. You had Calvary, which is what I still call it the Sears Roebuck site. Okay. And then the biggest one of all was the Laurel Hill Cemetery, Fireman's Fund, UC San Francisco plot. So that's how they were laid out. This map is kind of interesting because it shows streets that never came into existence going over the top of Lone Mountain. But this is where Lone Mountain campus of University of San Francisco is now, the Big Four. This is Oddfellows looking west. And here's you have how these cemeteries were laid out. Formal roads, edgings made out of granite. You have mausoleums. In the pre-Golden Gate Park days, the cemeteries in San Francisco were actually where people went for recreation. It was beautiful. You maybe went to see your departed. Maybe you just wanted a day away from the slums south of Market. And the Big Four Cemeteries is where you went. And they were accessible by steam railroads and cable cars that ran out to the cemeteries. And in fact, Presidio Avenue, its original name was Cemetery Avenue. Yeah, where the streetcars at. Yerba Buena Cemetery is still going into the 1860s, but it's less and less popular. And remember, this was a part of San Francisco that would never be developed, right? Ever. It's at the corner of 8th and Market. And what happened is they turned it into Yerba Buena Plaza. And in the late 1860s, they began to look at disinterring the people. There were something they were called the pioneers, because they'd been buried so early in the city's history. And that area was destined to become the first Civic Center Plaza. In fact, the dome of the great City Hall that was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake, right about where the Fulton Street area between the Asian Art Museum and the Public Library, where they've relocated this hideous monument, that's about where the dome was. In the course of building the new City Hall, they would uncover yet more of these indigent dead. So you needed another cemetery, another place to move. And this time they went and they looked to the furthest, most west, where the city's never ever going to expand. Land's End. And up there was created Golden Gate Cemetery, or City Cemetery, its more proper name. And because it was owned by the city, you could lease properties inside for your various plots. It wasn't very pretty, not like the Big Four cemeteries. These are people who were sort of like second stringers. There were various fraternal organizations. There were various second level, at least terms, economic religious groups that got plots out there. And there's Lincoln Park today with the outline of Old City Cemetery. This little hunk down here, this was sold to the U.S. Army as a site for harbor fortifications in the early 1890s, and Fort Miley, right? That's now the VA hospital. City Cemetery was so desolate and so little thought of that Alex and I in our research have only uncovered, I believe, 3 photographs taken inside City Cemetery. This is one of them. You're standing on a hillock looking northeast towards the Golden Gate, and this was a burial plot. We believe this is a burial plot for one of the German groups that had land out there. And we think that this little building here, on the other side of the fence from the Germans, was the French section. Go figure. This is a map that is, go ahead.
Were there no markers? I mean, or is it not used yet? Or is there one there?
I think what you're seeing is a lot of these plots were laid out. The headstones were nothing but boards, and they quickly went down. In fact, there's very few photographs that really show the burial sites. We'll come up with a couple of them, but oddly, it's few and far between, to be frank. This map, it's almost a cartoon. It bears very little to let cemetery really look at. One thing that Alex and I wanted to do is to figure out how was the place really laid out. In a couple minutes, I'll show you, there's all kinds of different maps, and it's just Kapakai is saying the line. It's all mixed up. What was really going on out there? We wanted to figure it out. Down here in the lower left, this is just a partial listing of the different groups that were in there. French Benevolent Society, the Germania Club, Grand Army of the Republic, Civil War vets, Jewish congregations, Master Mariners, sailors, Seaman's Friends, Scandinavian. Why weren't these people in the Big Four? Basically, money. Yeah, it cost to get into the Big Four cemeteries. This is, we call them second tier. And this doesn't mean any disrespect, it just means these weren't really the rich people. Some of them kind of bizarre. The Improved Order of Red Men. What God's name was that? And the Knights of Pythias. Well, these were fraternal organizations that you might join, partly for brotherhood and society, and also too because if you paid in, they would make sure that you were planted properly when you died. Not a lot of people had life insurance, there weren't a lot of social service nets, all these benevolent societies. There's only a couple of physical monuments left to show City Cemetery. This is perhaps the most impressive one. It has a nautical motif, and if you get up close to it, I thought it was interesting, it was ordered out of a catalog. Yeah, it's made of hollow bronze. The design of it is maritime because this was the this was the Lady Seaman's Friends plot. Lady Seaman's Friends, you gotta remember sailors, merchant marine, guys sailing before the mast were one of the most exploited, hard-worked, and least compensated groups in 19th century United States. They worked horrific hours, in horrific conditions, in a fall from a ship could cripple you for life. And a group of well-to-do ladies in New York formed a group called the Lady Seaman's Friends Society. What they did is they set up hotels, rooming houses, retirement homes where sailors could find a place, and then they also set up cemetery plots. And a lady by the name of Lambert headed up the branch out in San Francisco. And she's the one that helped pay for the monument. And she's the one that she was the director for the San Francisco area. It was customized. The periodical, one of the newspapers in the 1880s, they quoted the cemetery keeper as saying that this plot was, they said, them's mariners. We plant them here so they can watch the ships come in. Oh. And indeed, it's on a hillside looking right at the Golden Gate itself. One thing that we found out, going through the old records, is the Lady Seamans, they did annual reports. And the internet's an amazing thing, and we're finding that in their annual reports, they would list the names of the sailors who'd been buried up there. We've identified about 30.
Yeah, 30 or so. We know that there were 39 burials. We don't have all the annual reports yet, but
a lot of what they died of was injuries, obviously sustained while working a hard life. Interestingly, Mrs. Lambert, who was from New York, in one of the annual reports says that she wanted a plot for 4 spaces for her family at City Cemetery.
Wow.
Yes, and lo and behold, right next to the Sailor's Monument is the granite decorative curbing. Probably not in its original location, because it's been relocated.
very close, very close.
Very close.
Yeah.
And so we believe Mrs. Lambert's up there. Her newspaper, her burial notice simply says, interment will be private. So,
But it's on the golf course.
it's right on the golf course.
It's not so private.
Back then, that meant that the family was, the services are for family only. Another group that was heavily represented at City Cemetery were Chinese. Talk about a group that underwent the worst discrimination in San Francisco's history, the Chinese. And Chinese that came to California In the mid-19th century, they were coming here like everybody was. They were going to make a fortune. They weren't coming here to become Americans with the goal of becoming citizens. The vast majority were young men coming from impoverished areas of China, and their goal was to make a lot of money and go back to their town. A lot of them were from Canton province, and it didn't work out that way for a lot of them. A lot of them ended up knowing that they were never going to leave California. And what you didn't want to do was you did not want your body buried across the sea. You wanted to be with your family. You wanted your grave to be tended by your relatives. So initially, out near Laurel Hill, up until the mid-1870s, was the Chinese burial section. And then in 1877, the city said, all the Chinese, they have to move to Land's End, the city cemetery. The funeral, this is highly romanticized, fictionalized, if you will, although there are some true elements in it. Food laid out, incense being burned, paper money. You were interned, and then after 2 years, your body was disinterred, your bones cleaned, you were packed in a small container, and you were shipped back to your hometown. That was the idea. And that was what, to be frank, that doesn't do a lot for property values, you know, if you're living next door to the cemetery. So putting them out in city cemetery, that was a pragmatic decision on the part of the Board of Supervisors. They were called the Chinese Six Companies. The Chinese Six Companies, they're the ones that were the protector, the benevolent organizations for people from various parts of China. We're living in San Francisco. And they're going to come back again. This is number 2 of only 3 photos we have. This is it was in the Bancroft Library, and it was identified as a 1906 earthquake refugee camp. It's not. It's not. These are the gates to the various plots inside City Cemetery. This is the Chinese section. Tea is being prepared. It looks like punks burning on the ground, incense. This is probably either an interment ceremony or perhaps a revisiting of someone who had been buried during the 2 years they'd be underground. Before you were buried, just like when you get buried today, you have a chapel where last services are carried out, last prayers said, say goodbye to the departed. And this little mortuary chapel was constructed by the the Kong Chow Company. And it's still there today, in the trees right alongside the first fairway. Above it, there's an inscription card that translates as Kong Chow Company's resting place, temporary resting place for coffins before final burial. One way to say it's a funeral chapel. And inside, there would have been an area for a small altar where incense was burned, offerings, traditionally paper money, paper clothes, sweetmeats and food would be set out. You'd come in, pay your last respects, then you were taken off, you were buried on the hillside in one of the many plots. And then there was the biggest section of City Cemetery, that was the pauper section. And I have to use some stand-in photos, because there are no photos of the pauper section. This is another pauper's graveyard, I believe down in the Colma area, but it gives you an idea of the rude conditions. The city's, boy, how do they describe them? The leavings of the foundlings' home, the found floating in the bay, dead by suicide, drunk. The coroner took you over, and they paid about $4 to bury you. You were sent out to City Cemetery. You were planted in a grave that we know a lot of morbid details. Originally, the graves were only 4.5 feet deep.
Yeah, in the early years of the cemetery, they were pretty shallow. The requirement was only 4.5 feet.
Yep, 6-foot coffin. Didn't matter if you were 6'3", they're going to fit you in a 6-foot coffin. These are actually from San Quentin, but these are headboards. City Cemetery was even cheaper. They didn't even engrave the headboard, just painted them in black paint, which washed away almost immediately, and the boards rotted and they collapsed and they fell over. So there was almost no way to track the almost 20,000 that ended up buried in the pauper section. And to complicate things, of course, the 1906 earthquake destroyed most of the records of City Cemetery. That probably because it was the coroner, and the coroner's office at that time was, I believe, in the Hall of Justice, and it burned. So there is no master register of everybody that was buried in the City Cemetery. 1909, oh, back up. The move to, keep pushing the cemeteries further and further out, it reached a peak. No more interments after 1898. Well, we found maybe a couple of dozen entered in 1899, but that was it. City cemetery was ordered closed. And in 1900, an order came down, there's not going to be any more burials anywhere in the city in any of the cemeteries. Right? It's over. And quickly on the heels of that came the regulation that everybody that's buried in the city, they're all to be disinterred. The only exceptions are the Presidio, National Cemetery, and the Mission Dolores. Everybody else was to be moved out and put away. So what do you do with Old City Cemetery? 1909, it's renamed. It's now Lincoln Park. Yep. Oh, that same view that you saw earlier on, pretty much the same view today. Golfers, duffers. Okay. And here's a great shot. Here's the Chinese funerary temple right next to the T. Why were these two left behind? A couple of things come to mind. One is that a landscape architect thought that they were interesting and they should be combined into the cemetery. The other is that these may have been the most permanent objects in City Cemetery. So it was just easier to leave them behind and build a golf course around them. 1921, the Lincoln Golf Course, it's well established, been there for 12 years. And the Spreckles family decides they're going to endow a memorial museum to the dead of World War I. So the Palace of the Legion of Honor, construction begins in 1921. And it was like there was a corporate loss of memory in San Francisco. That when the Legion of Honor went in, it was splat on top of what had been the big paupers field. And the newspapers were full of all these horror stories of bodies being uncovered by the scrapers and the diggers up where the Legion of Honor is being constructed. It was like, how did this happen? It was like, it was a conscious decision. Supposedly about 1,500 bodies were recovered. Actually not recovered. They seem to have been uncovered. Yeah, more like pushed aside.
Scraped away, yeah.
Put in big Arnold hits. When they were building the Legion of Honor in 1921, 1,500. And then when 1994, when they rebuilt the Legion of Honor, seismic upgrade and expanded the underground galleries, they came up with 750 more. Right in the courtyard, underneath the colonnades, on the lawns out front. So, City Cemetery has left a long legacy. But again, how was it laid out? How did these people end up here in this position? And what's with the crazy monuments? I'm going to hand it over to Alex, because this is his bailiwick.
Yeah, so as we sort of said earlier, about 9 months ago, John and I were chatting in this very room, and he's like, "Hey, have you heard of City Cemetery?" And I was like, and he's like, "Does this sound interesting to you?" And I'm like, "John, I just got done mapping Oddfellow Cemetery. Like, I think I'm good with one cemetery." But then we got the chatting, and John Freeman and I were chatting a little bit too about the resources that were out there, and I got intrigued in City Cemetery, and despite City Cemetery, Golden Gate Cemetery being one of the lesser documented cemeteries in the city, John and I engaged in trying to map it as best as possible. We thought it would be interesting that to try and map it out, because there's a chance that future bodies might be found, and wouldn't it be nice to better contextualize those discoveries? So of course, one of the things you should do anytime you're starting a new mapping exercise is just go ahead and see what other maps have already been done. And it turns out there are actually a lot of maps of City Cemetery, or at least a lot of representations of it. But unfortunately, none of them really seem to agree about the details, which is really important. Didn't even really agree with where the major avenues went minor ones that might have went through the city. So we sort of, put these on the back burner. And of course consulted photographs, and as John said earlier, there aren't that many. Most either show city cemetery from a distance, it's in the backdrop, and half the time it's not even in focus. Or you just get a tiny corner of it photographed, like this one in the lower left-hand corner was the Knights of Pythias section. That was taken in 1905, so there weren't even that many gravestones still there. You see a couple of them, there's maybe a couple more working off on the tree line, but by and large, not a lot to see. There was one aerial photograph that we found. It was taken in 1920, so it postdates the cemetery. There is some cemetery infrastructure that's still visible to a degree. You can actually see the mortuary structure, the mortuary chapel that John was pointing out.
Here.
It's actually.
Yeah, push the button.
Oh, all right, great. It's right there.
Oh.
And looks like there's some, there's a building right around here, and another one, I think it was right there. So things that were left over from the period of the cemetery, but virtually there are no headstones visible that we can see in this photograph. Of course, we also consulted the annual reports that the city superintendent would have submitted to the Board of Supervisors. These don't cover the entire period of the cemetery. The cemetery existed from 1870 until 1898, and the annual reports start in the late 1870s and carry on. So we're missing like 8 or 9 years worth of interments. We did find one plot map, and so this is the Knights of Pythias section. That's it's this area right here. It's just to the right of the entrance to Lincoln Park, sort of the playground area. And the only reason that this was filed with the city, this we found it in city collections. The only reason this was filed with the city, actually, I think Carrie Lentz found this one. If I'm not mistaken, I think you were the one that found this map. Carrie's an archaeologist. We'll be talking a little bit more about some of her help later. But found this map with the city. It was filed with the city because there was the dispute about who owned part of this plot. Sutro Railroad actually cut through a corner of the cemetery. You can see it right there. This, Knights of Pythias complained, of course, and the city said, okay, well, file a plot map with this, demonstrating that you actually were granted this land. So that brings us to this slide, which is that newspaper articles are also a really, really important source of information for us. Actually, the single most important source of information. These things were often full of little clues about how one plot was located relative to another, how the cemetery was used and how its uses sort of changed over time, who moved in, who left. Really, really important source of information. Now, in addition to newspaper articles and annual reports and photographs, we also just walked the site and looked for vestiges of the former cemetery. And there was a lot to see. There was a lot left over. A lot of this is the photos that you're seeing. Most of it is probably cemetery infrastructure, but there's always the possibility that some of what we were looking at, was early park infrastructure. So possibly, related to the early golf course. You'll notice that there was a little exploratory digging that was done. This was done with Carrie, who's working with the planning, or interning with the planning department. So it was all sanctioned and all documented, and all this information is, all these sites are documented in the state database. So I would just like to say, don't do any exploratory digging unless you're with an archaeologist. Really, really important. And all this stuff was covered back up to the extent that it was ever buried in the first place. So that brings us to this really interesting map. So
Jump in here quick.
I'll just say something real quick. Earlier we said that most of the maps that we found weren't very helpful. This is the one exception. This was really important.
Yeah. A friend of mine, some of you might know, named Jim Delgado, he was the historian for GGNRA for many years, went to work for NOAA, and he told me, just in passing, that they digitized all these incredible coast survey maps from the 19th century and that showed the old fortification sites, and I said, well, send them on. And he sent me this one. The title says Fort Point to Point San Jose. It was the shoreline from Fort Point all the way down to Point San Jose's Fort Mason. But I looked at it, I was going, there's a little strange inset, this little thing. What the heck is it? Well, the digitizing was phenomenal. And it's City Cemetery, included on in exquisite detail by the Geodetic Survey.
Now, when you're looking at these dotted lines, we interpreted those as fence lines, and that's supported by other sources that we found. We know that a lot of benevolent organizations and the Chinese 6 companies, which occupy this area right here, they're required to fence in their plats as part of their land grants by the city. You also see that there are some structures. We think we now know what these structures were. Superintendent's house, a chapel of some kind. I'm getting ahead of myself though. What was also really exciting about this map, aside from just having this, is that it was annotated, which was really helpful. You'll see the approved order of Red Men up here. So that's that fraternal organization that John mentioned earlier. So we know that this was they occupied, their burial plot was over here. Down here we see this is the Greek plot, and then the Slavonic, I think it's the Slavonic Illyric Mutual Benevolent Organization, or Mutual Benefit Society. Really hard to read, but when we enhanced this, it seemed to say French Benevolent, which was a really nice piece of information to have. Unfortunately, no amount of squinting or photographic enhancement could tell us what the writing that was here said. So that's a mystery for now. So we took all this information that we had, all the newspaper articles, photographs to the extent we had them, the things that we'd seen on the ground, and this map that I just showed you, we started to combine them in Google Earth Pro, which is basically a very accessible GIS software. And so here we see Lincoln Park today. This is very recent satellite imagery. We've got the Legion of Honor, the parking lot, and the VA Medical Center area, and old, Fort Miley over on the west. And we layered on top of that 1920 aerial that I showed earlier. And on top of that, a really simple plat map of City Cemetery. This was useful for establishing the northern boundary. We knew how far it went east and to the south, but knowing where it stopped at the north was really helpful.
An interesting detail is if you look at the bottom edge, Clement Street was inside the boundary of City Cemetery. Yeah, so a lot of our early rectification, we just took it for granted that the edge of the map should be the inside, the north curve. No, it's extended clear across the street.
This is where things got really interesting, because when we layered that 1882 map of City Cemetery on top of everything that we've done so far, we noticed a few things. I'll just say that this is actually a slightly later version of the map that you saw earlier. This is the Coast Survey map from, I think it dates to 1900. Things either hadn't changed very much at that point, or they just hadn't updated their map, probably the latter. And it has some top of the lines, so those are the red lines that you're seeing. What we noticed is that the tree line, the existing tree line of that 1920 aerial, some of the shrubs and the trees and the bushes, they lined up remarkably well with the fence lines of some of the burial plots that were known to have existed in the cemetery. And so it would seem that when the city took over, or took control of the city cemetery and turned it into a park, that they left all that, at least in the early years. Which makes sense, if all these different organizations have gone through the trouble of beautifying the cemetery, why not just leave all that shrubbery around for golfers to use? Now, I mentioned earlier that newspaper articles were extremely important. There was one article in particular which was, I would say, at least as important as this Coast Survey map. It was a piece that appeared in 1877 in the San Francisco Chronicle. And the reporter basically just went out to City Cemetery and he walked around and just described what he saw. So he started the reader at the gate and he walked, we were able to sort of trace his path based on some of the annotations that we had. So we already had fixed known points where we knew where certain burial plots were. We were able to fill in some of the other details based on his description. It says, oh, the 1950th section's over here, and then the Old Friends Society, which was a pioneer society, they were just to the north, and then off this direction was the Jewish cemeteries. And he describes the Jewish cemeteries in exquisite detail, and so forth and so on. Then he starts the reader back at the gate, and he walks around the cemetery in another direction. And so with this article and all the information that we had before, we were able to figure out about half of the cemetery. We made some really good progress just with these few resources. Of course, you'll notice that there are a lot of areas that were just unaccounted for, or maybe we thought we knew what was in a certain area, but we just didn't have enough evidence to draw a shape there and say this is where the plot was. So we went back to the newspaper articles that we had dug up. We found around 170 dealing with City Cemetery that told us how it was laid out in some small way or how it was used, and all this information was really helpful. And with all of that, we were pretty much able to fill in the rest of the cemetery. Now, this map lives in Google Earth Pro, so some of the names are sort of sitting on top of each other. If you were to zoom in, it would sort of sort itself out. But yeah, we're able to figure out most of the cemetery. There's still some uncertainty, and we've tried to represent that uncertainty in our file. You know, we think, for example, that city and county section 5 was up here, but we're not 100% certain. So we've drawn the shape, we've got it labeled, we've got some information there, but it's going to be up to future researchers to you know, continue working with the information that we've come up with. Sorry.
Oops. Hold on for a sec here. If you look, the center section here, these are the Chinese sections. To the right, you start to remember the old artistic looking, almost cartoon maps with the sinuous shapes. You sort of get a hint of that. It's going on over here. 1877, 7 years after the cemetery opens, that's when the Board of Supervisors say, Chinese, you're moving. And it seems to be that they just plopped the square Chinese sections right atop without bearing any relationship to the original road plan. And then on the other side of the chain, it tends to pick up again. A couple areas to really point out is this one over here, and this one over here, and this one over here, oh, and up here. Up here, city and county. Those are reserved for the city. You know what that means?
Pauper.
Yeah, would have been the Potter's Fields. Now, because this is this map lives in GIS, you can attach all kinds of information to the shapes that we've drawn. So when you click on one of these, in this case, I clicked on Section 8, which was Section 8, which was one of the Potter's Fields. We've attached all of our notes and excerpts from all of the primary sources that we consulted when we were geolocating, and drawing the extent of the burial plot. Just to give you, I'll just read one of these real quick. This comes from that 1887 article that I mentioned earlier. In the low ground west of the Chinese district are the remains of those who were removed from the old Yerba Buena cemetery. In a small enclosed plot in the center of the reservation are the bones of the unknown dead removed from Yerba Buena. Well, we know where the Chinese section was, thanks to some other sources. So we know that probably in this area, or possibly in this area, are where the Yerba Buena burials were. So if archaeologists do, in the future, encounter several hundred probably disarticulated bones, buried fairly close together.
Right.
There's a pretty good chance that those are the Yerba Buena burials. Actually, yeah, go ahead.
Can you actually go back to that map and point where the, I'm sorry, I'm a little disoriented, where
Yeah.
the Legion of Honor would be?
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but right in this area.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Back on the map, it said Cogswell's Monument,
That was
You know
that
that-
tall monument that,
the one that
the sailors, yeah,
Oh.
because Dr. Cogswell helped endow it, and Cogswell had a thing for building monuments. And in fact, if you go into Washington Square in San Francisco, the monument of, for some reason, Ben Franklin, it's a Cogswell monument.
I knew that Dr. Cogswell, his family been here for like 6 generations.
Yeah.
And he was one of the founders of Kaiser Permanente Hospital.
Yeah, and he was yeah.
Didn't like
So-
liquor.
So the fact that it says Cogswell Monument on that map, that's a reference point that we can keep using, because that, Lord knows, that hasn't moved. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you, sorry to.
So earlier we said that most photographs weren't very helpful. This is the one exception. We actually found this subsequent to pretty much all the map work that we had done. Would have been nice to have had it early on, but it corroborated nearly everything that we had learned about the cemetery up until this point. What was really great about this photograph, it was actually quite small, maybe only about yay big. We scanned it at 1200 dpi and were able to recover an incredible amount of detail. So just to orientate you, this is the present day, roughly where the present day entrance to Lincoln Park is. And so as you turn left, that where the parking lot is and beyond, that was all part of a giant potter's field that was used, up until about 1882, the fall of 1882. It was almost totally full at that point, and they had to start using another section of the cemetery for burying the indigent dead. And that's this area right here. And we knew that Section 2 was used for the burial of indigent dead. And we had a municipal report from 1881 where the superintendent saying, all right, Board of Supervisors, Section 2 is filling up really fast, and these bodies are getting a little bit too close to my well. So I would suggest that we start using Section 11, which is 900 feet west of where the Chinese section is. He pretty much lays it out. And so we see that. We see that this section was actually, so this is the superintendent's house right here. The graves probably stopped right around here, so they were actually pretty close. He wasn't lying. He wasn't. What's also interesting about this photograph is it shows that some of those newspaper sketches that we encountered early on in our research were actually pretty accurate. We suspected that this might have been drawn from Section 2 looking west towards the Chinese section, and here we pretty much see the exact area. It's possible that the sketch artist was standing a little bit further north, but in either case, you see row after row of wooden headboards, and then the Chinese gates, the entrances to the Chinese burial plots, just a little further up the hillside. Oh yeah, and then this was used for, John, you know a little bit more about this than I do. Was it used for burning incense? It was like a large masonry structure.
It was like for burning offerings.
Oh, burning
Traditionally, you
offerings,
burn paper clothes and paper money at a Chinese, so those are the Chinese sections.
yeah. Now, a word about some of the maps that we talked about earlier. I said that most of them really didn't agree with each other about how the cemetery was laid out. For the most part, that was true. But I noticed some patterns as I stared at these things long enough. And one of them was that there were several maps that seemed to show structures in 3 different parts of the cemetery. We've got a little, almost looks like a building up in the upper left-hand corner. There's something much larger right here. Now this, for reference, this would be pretty much where the Legion of Honor is today. But these maps date to the 1880s, the latest one dates to 1908, so it couldn't possibly be the Legion of Honor. World War I hadn't happened yet, no one had conceived of building a memorial to anyone in City Cemetery at this point. And then there's a cross. Here we see what appears to be a building. So this sort of looks like a chapel to me. And I thought, well, this is interesting. They're all showing slightly different representations of sort of the same basic things. You know, what could these possibly be? We went back and we looked at the initial report that the county surveyor had submitted to the Board of Supervisors in 1870 when he laid it out. It's a fairly lengthy report where he says that he's laid out the city cemetery following the principles of English landscape gardening, and he makes recommendations for various improvements to the cemetery, which areas should be used for the burial of indigent dead, which can be given to various benevolent organizations, so forth and so on. And in this report, he knows that there's a good source of spring water in the northwest corner of the cemetery, and that some curbing should be built up to basically create a little collection point. And then this water should be pumped up to a much larger reservoir somewhere in the cemetery. He says that it's noted on the map and that the reservoir should be 100 by 75 feet. And then he also mentions that the city cemetery should include a chapel that could be used by folks of any denomination. And so I think that's what we're actually looking at here. We're looking at probably a pump house. This actually in GIS it specs out to about 100 by 75 feet. And then this is probably the chapel. And so I think what we're actually looking at here, go back one. These are all actually representations of the original plan for City Cemetery. Not how it was built, but what the plan looked like. We actually see a little bit of evidence in one of a little additional evidence in one of these maps. Now, I'll just say real quickly, some of these maps were probably copied from other maps that existed already, and based on detail that either was or wasn't included in some of these, I've created a plausible sort of family tree of who might have been copying who. There might be other maps that we're not aware of yet, too, that could be folded into this, but it gives you some idea. I think that all three of these were probably copied from the original plan. One of these maps was done by a man named William P. Humphreys. Humphreys laid out City Cemetery. He was the one that submitted his report to the Board of Supervisors. So presumably any map that he created in 1884 would have shown his original plan for the cemetery. So it would be marvelous if an original plan for the annotated original plan for the cemetery showed up at some point. We were not able to find one. It may be out there still. I'll hand it back over to John.
Yeah. I mentioned the order went out in the early 1900s, yet no more burials in the city, quickly followed by, okay, everybody in the Big Four cemeteries, gotta go. And what happened was, through the 1930s and the 1940s, a long process went on of removing the dead from the Big Four cemeteries. In this case, this is according to Oddfellows. And the Catholic Church fought like mad. It was consecrated ground where Calvary Cemetery was located. For many years, Laurel Hill Cemetery, the bodies had been relocated, but the big monuments were left behind. What happened was when it came time to move everybody, the city wasn't going to pay to move all those giant marble and granite things. That was up to the family. And if the family didn't come forward, the stuff was left behind. Eventually, when they cleared all the monuments that had been left behind, they were used for landfill along Ocean Beach, incorporated it into the seawall at Aquatic Park and along Marina. Okay, various odds and ends. And what seems to have happened was that people just assumed, because all the bodies had been removed from the Big Four, and obviously they wouldn't put a golf course over the bodies, so the same thing had happened at City Cemetery. Wrong. These are 1909 articles, and the pertinent sections say the body should be removed within the specified time. That time has long since expired. While some of the bodies may have been removed, there are many still remaining. By destruction of the records during the fire, It's impossible to identify the graves, and to those remaining will be leveled over and the tombs destroyed. Over here, the graves will be leveled and the tombs raised to make way for the landscape gardener.
So the benevolent societies, they were given a time frame for getting out of city cemetery.
They
And
couldn't do it.
yeah, the city said, if you don't, we'll just level it. We'll just level your plots.
And there was a protest, of course, against some of this, and some folks complained to the city about the bodies being left behind. And the quote from the article, "If your plans contemplate the desecrating of the graves of the dead," that's Mr. Sullivan, "then we must protest." The response, "We're not going to anything of the kind," answered Chairman Height. "We intend to cover them with flowers and lawns and make the place more beautiful." And this little slug here, this ran as one of those little filler pieces at the bottom of newspaper articles in the 40s and 50s, which is common knowledge. One of those things, back up one. Yeah, down here it says Sanitary Inspector Hassler said that there was still about 20,000 graves there, mostly the indigents. Lincoln Park was intentionally constructed with the idea of not desecrating graves, but that it would be a place for people to enjoy life, respectfully remembering the people who are underneath them. Well, go back to 1994 at the Legion of Honor. It was quite obvious, again, that to me it's almost unfathomable that only 12 years after they closed the cemetery and declared it a park, nobody remembered. And even worse, like 1994, the corporate memory again still seemed to be, really, there's a whole bunch of dead people? Now there was work done, Carrie, before the thing, and they went and they did potholing, and they found bone fragments and they found some redwood, so there was the intent that there probably might be human remains. Nothing like what they encountered. It just went on. Now they say 750 individual graves, they think, and they think somewhere over 800, maybe 900 human remains. You can't really tell because frequently they would put more than one person in a coffin. Sometimes a coffin would only have essentially medical waste. Sometimes you would have multiple fetuses in a coffin. Unlike in 1921, the scrapers just picked everybody up and pushed them over into a corner. The archaeologists were brought in, I should say to the great dismay of the contractor, who had to sit there and watch while the folks with the whisk brooms are working over the site. And I've been on projects like this. I'm not an archaeologist, but I look over everybody's shoulder. And I know what it's like to have a hard hat sitting there looking at his watch while you're trying to carry out field research. The spacing, is 6 foot long. Sometimes you found some really weird stuff. Those aren't bones piled up by the archaeologists. Those were bones that were probably uncovered. They put the sewer line in, right through a gravesite, and displaced bones that were just tossed on top of the plumbing work. This is one that just came to light. This was found underneath one of the colonnades. Where are his knees and where are his feet? This is a concrete floor, so when they were building the foundations, they carved through the coffin, through the body, and just poured the thing. There is ample research that was done on these unidentified people. No names, of course. We were able to tell quite a few of them were Catholic, based on medals and rosary. They've been able to tell a lot about the lives they lived based on their teeth, and terrible teeth for the most part, reflecting hard work, not a lot of money for dental care. A lot of them led hard lives too, a lot of injuries that had partly healed, maybe a result of hard work. Not a lot of women, a whole lot of guys. Yeah.
Why is it that color? Is that normal? It's kind of reddish.
I don't know.
John,
That was
Go
the
ahead, Carrie.
International Order of Redmen.
That's a better answer.
Carrie?
We've found historic burials before that have red staining that we think is mercury residue, which was a common syphilitic cure.
Some coffins were lined with zinc.
It does.
which was generally done if you died of a contagious disease. So the city has the records of all of these, and you've had a chance to look through them?
Briefly, yes. Carrie and I, they're stored at the planning department, and Carrie and I went through them one afternoon for about an hour. There's lots of information there that didn't make it in. There wasn't space for it in the final report, so I think there's a real opportunity to probably revisit some of what was uncovered in the early 90s.
Objects that were found buried with them. Some makes total sense: shoes, dentures, combs. Why you were buried with silverware, I have no idea. Why you'd be buried with a pistol, or why the pistol wasn't pilfered, when you were in the morgue. They don't exactly treat your personal respect with the greatest degree of professionalism in the 19th century. And this was a huge effort.
So this is a map that I sort of hastily put together based on series. Let me back up. So the 1997 report for the Legion of Honor excavation. It's a fascinating read, but the maps are in chunks, and so I took all of those maps and I just combined them together. The resolution's not great because it's coming out of a Xerox copied report, but this kind of goes back to what I said earlier about I think there's a real opportunity to reinterpret some of what was found in the early 90s. We know that this was section 11 of the cemetery, which was used for the burial of indigent dead. We know that this area over here, where some other burials were found, that was actually a different section. The archaeologists at the time, of course, didn't have that information, so I think there's an opportunity to go back and look at what was found and look at the differences. Notice that there's also a clustering of zinc-lined or zinc-encased coffins, and we know from newspaper requests for proposals that were put out by the city that for the burial of indigent dead, there's a contract that was let every year that zinc-lined caskets and zinc-enclosed caskets were required in all cases of smallpox. And because a lot of these, the burials were done one after another, row after row, because there's this clustering and because some of these rows date to at least the late 1880s because of some coins that were found. They could actually date to the 1890s, but they seem to date to the late 1880s or sometime in the 1890s. Because there's this clustering here, there's the chance that these might be the victims of San Francisco's last smallpox epidemic in 1888. Claimed a couple hundred lives, if I'm not mistaken. But that's speculative at this point.
And the story continues. A friend of mine who works at the Legion of Honor in their paper conservation lab, she was walking to her car that was parked over at Fort Miley, and she came across this, and she called me. She'd been on one of my walks through Fort Miley, and she said, "You gotta think I'm crazy, but I think I found a human bone." And I said, "Take a picture, you have a cell phone." And they said, "Oh God, that's a pelvis." Call the police, and they did, and it was a round robin of, okay, whose jurisdiction is it? VA hospital, it's San Francisco coroner, it's the park police. No, it's not a Native American, it's not a murder, call the archaeologist. And they found a femur in close proximity, but that was it. And the archaeologist figured it was possibly backscatter from the construction of the Legion of Honor. But this, if you go back to this here, the fence line that separates the city's Lincoln Park from Fort Miley today runs right about here. Do you think that they stopped burying people, before crossing a fence line for a not yet established military post? How far do these burials continue? In other places, there's still discoveries being made. In this case, at the University of San Francisco, only a few years ago, when they were excavating for one of the new science buildings, 50. This was old Masonic Cemetery. And only last year, no bodies, but this is the site of the Sears Roebuck at Masonic and Geary.
Target.
Got to use your...
Just for the younger people.
For the younger people. piles and piles of funerary monuments, curbing left over from long vanished Calvary Cemetery. Yeah. And one thing I come back to is, we kind of get fixated on where were the fence lines? And, these seem to date from such and such, and the monument was ordered from a catalog. And that's great stuff. It's going down the rabbit hole history, but I try to come back periodically and remember it's about people. These were the working class folks. Whether they ended up in the Italian section or the Jewish section or the Knights of Pythias or an unknown plotter's field, or maybe they were, only 2 years in the ground before hopefully they got back to their hometown in Canton province, where the vast majority of these people were headed, or found their final resting place watching the ships come in from the slope below Miss Lambert's and the Cogswell Monument. These were our San Francisco forebears. I don't know, a lot of you were in here, the old San Francisco families. By the grace of God, but we had enough that we were, buried in originally up there in Calvary, and then moved down to Holy Cross. But if my great-great-grandfather's fortunes had gone the other way, he might still be out there next to Joan of Arc at the Legion of Honor.
Not to say that Indian people are still buried in unmarked graves,
Right.
quite frequently.
Oh, quite frequently.
Today.
Quite frequently.
In fact, mostly.
Yeah. Theoretically, a book should exist somewhere that tells you where those today go.
Yes.
These folks, it's that's our cop out as San Francisco historians. We don't know. The records are gone. 1906. But in this case, it was true. Yeah. So next time you go to the Legion of Honor, and you're going to see the Impressionist exhibit. Take a look over the wall from the parking lot. Remember the folks that went there before us, and a lot of them still might be there. Alex, you got some stats.
So this is just a quick recap of sort of like all the new insights that we gained during the course of this 9-month-long project. Well, first and foremost, we now have a map that shows what parts of the cemetery were used, where and when, which is something that hasn't existed before. It should be of benefit to any future archaeological work. We really want to help better contextualize these discoveries. There were there was a skeleton that was found in 2010 near the California street steps. There wasn't really any interpretive work done on that set of remains. We actually now know that person would have been buried in the Society of Old Friends, most likely the Society of Old Friends plot. As it happens, there weren't that many people buried there. One of them was Charles Goff. Goff Street was named after, so we don't have any record of him moving, so perhaps they found Charles Goff. We don't know. There was another one that found way back in the 70s. A tree blew over and a coffined skeleton turned up. And I don't think an archaeologist actually...
Did your maps show that the Italians were right along that edge?
So that the burial that I mentioned in 2010 was a little bit south of their plot. And we know that there were a couple of, they were known as the Colored Masons. Also had a plot in that section too. It was the Golden Gate Lodge of the, it was basically another branch of the Oddfellows, but they were sometimes conflated with the Masons. So City Cemetery, we now know is significantly larger than previous estimates. So I think most estimates that I've seen say that there are 18,000 plus, because there was an annual report in 1893 that said that there were 18,000 people buried at that time. Well, there are several more years of interments. Through our research, we were able to show that there was a total of 29,000 interments. Now, the state of City Cemetery, the net size, there's always a fluctuation. There were people coming in, there were people going out. And so in 1898, there were about 22,400 folks still on the ground. We know that there were removals subsequent to that, but by just about any measure, City Cemetery was larger than Calvary Cemetery. And if you look at total interments, it was probably larger than Oddfellows Cemetery. So when we talk about the Big Four cemeteries that existed around Lone Mountain, we might want to start saying Big Five, because the city cemetery was actually larger than a couple of those. So, how many people still are in the ground? That's a $1 million question. We estimate that between 10,000 and 19,700, or almost 20,000 are still there. There's a $10,000, or excuse me, a 10,000 interment guess based because we just don't have records. We don't know how many benevolent societies actually cleared their plots. We have some newspaper accounts of some money being appropriated for clearing. We don't know if it was actually used. We know that one of the Jewish cemeteries was cleared. We don't know if all the Jewish cemeteries were cleared. So if it's just the indigents that are in the ground, about 10,000. But if there's more, if there's Chinese, if there's Italians, then we're probably at a much higher number. And that sort of plays into my last point, which is there's only limited evidence of some of the benevolent organizations removing their dead.
Question?
Would some of the cemeteries in Colma have records of is it called reinterment or something? And where they came from?
So that's one of our opportunities. That's a great question. And that's one of our opportunities for future research. We pour a lot of time and effort into this, but it's just impossible to do everything. And so I think there's an opportunity to follow up with some of these cemeteries, some of the benevolent organizations that still exist, at least in name, to find out if they have records of the dead actually being removed.
I'm with the San Mateo County Genealogical Society, and we're in the process of indexing the Valente Marini books. And there's one whole book that is reinterments, but before that, there's from 1888 on all of the burials that go into city cemeteries. So as for indexing, we're putting the cemetery in there. That's available online. We keep updating it as we go on the San Mateo County Genealogical website.
That's exciting.
And we also have gone and digitized all of the early books that are falling apart, the ones that got buried in Washington Park so that they didn't burn in the fires after the earthquake.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. That's great. That's great. I think to my second point, I think there's an opportunity to continually mine digitize newspapers for additional information. There's only a handful of San Francisco newspapers that have been close to fully digitized, and new digitizations are always happening. And there's smaller papers out there that are going to be digitized one day. And I'm sure they're chock full of useful information. And then again, I think there's an opportunity to revisit the Legion of Honor data. So we have a lot of people to thank for all their assistance.
Thank you all for coming. We can stay and have questions, and you can still have some wine and all that. I just want to quickly say to people who have to leave, though, I forgot to mention this, but we have a DVD about the removal of the cemeteries. The Big Four, mostly, that are over there on the table if you want to learn more about that. That's over for sale over there. But I also want to point out that these two started doing this work because they came to an event here. Alex was doing the event and John just came to it. And with help from John Freeman, this is all starting. So this is exactly why we got this place. It's for conversations like this, to hear about the Valente records, and that history can keep progressing, historical research. So thank you for coming tonight. You're supporting what we do, and become a member if you're not.
Mention that if you did not see the original program that you're referring to, Alex is doing it with a lot more added to the Untitled Cemetery for the San Francisco Historical Society. 1 month from now, next March 12th at Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, just down the street. Yeah.
I have a couple comments. First of all, thanks a lot for doing this. Or either, I think I've been to a tour out of Sutro Baths with you. Over the past year.
There's been a few of those.
And you and your colleague, I'm a 30-year veteran of the planning department. So I'd love to chat after this. For those that are not familiar, both those monuments are very visible from public spaces. Going into Lincoln Park, you can see the Chinese off to the right, off the first fairway, and you can see that other, what was it called, the catalog monument?
Cogswell.
Cogswell Monument, you can see standing from the public viewing area up where the Sandy Calder is. I think it's up there where you can see it down
Yes, right
off
below
the
you.
15th fairway. Did you find that this information corroborated or, I don't know, laid rest myths that might be found on the history of the Lincoln Park Golf Course website, which talked about also a section in one of the fairways being laid out where Serbians were buried?
There was a section parallel to Clement Street that would have been the,
Taken Serbians?
right.
Well, that would make sense because there's a fairway that runs right up that way.
If I remember on that credit website, like the first few holes were laid out as early as like 1903.
That's correct, and that's.
Which means they must have been almost
three
playing
phases.
through the-
It was done in 3 phases.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that had anything to do with the moving or the, the schedules that were making the land available after they'd been cleared or supposedly acquiesced. There was also a reference on that website to a property transaction for part of this land being privately held at a period of time that was subsequently donated to Lincoln Park. And I haven't heard mention of that in your presentation.
There was a section that I think belonged to the Sutro estate that may have been added
Oh, that.
to flesh it out. Yeah, the city purchased some Sutro lands adjacent on the north side.
Oh, okay. And my final comment or question has to do with, the buttressing or the seawall work that might have been done with some of the old tombstones or headstones. There's the wave organ, as I understand it, was built with tombstones and headstones. And, right, and so, did any of those come from here, or did they all come from Colma? Do you know?
We all came from
They all came from San
And they all
Francisco.
came from
They all came from San Francisco?
All these cemeteries they're talking about.
Because that wasn't built until like the
Which one they built,
80s. I think the late 80s is when the wave organ
The
was.
breakwater
actually
was
constructed.
pre-existing, the waves were ordered by this many.
But I've seen it at low tide,
Census
so
cemetery.
maybe.
I think, good.
Why don't, Alex and John are here, why don't we all get up and stretch our legs and have some wine, and you can go over and ask them anything you want.
Can I
Yeah.
make a real quick-
Carrie, please.
Yeah,
She's our archaeologist.
Yeah, real quick, sorry, Carrie.
Real quickly, I think I emailed about a quarter of you this summer. I was doing research on the cemeteries in San Francisco for the planning department. Raise your hand if you knew we had a city archaeologist for San Francisco. 1, 2. We do her name, there's actually 1.5. Allison Vanderslice and Sally Morgan. They brought me on as an intern to map all the cemeteries in San Francisco, because previously we've had old maps that do show some of the cemeteries, but not all of them, especially the early 1850s pioneer cemetery. I'm an archaeologist, but I'm also a grad student, and I'm currently doing research on I'm just establishing a foundational guide and map to all the cemeteries in San Francisco, much like you've probably seen or may have seen Ron Filioni's SF Genealogy Cemetery page, which is great, but now we're bringing a little bit more of the new research as well as the archaeological data to what he already has. So as part of my master's project, I'm establishing a list of stakeholders who maybe in the future, if we do find human remains, would be interested in being contacted, because there isn't a lot of legal structure to protect historic burials right now. So if you come by, see me, sign up, get on the list, and you'll be informed and possibly contacted.
To do what? I mean, what happens if you contact us?
Well, I might contact you maybe in the future to talk just like, do you have relatives, or what's your relation? Or are you a newcomer who's just fascinated by the cemeteries?
Someone asked, you can't do DNA off of any of the bones.
Oh, we can,
You
yes.
can.
Currently, there's a professor at UC Davis who is doing isotopic analysis as well as genetic analysis of Edith Cone.
Yep.
And some of the remains that were recently found from Yerba-Buena Cemetery.
Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.